Defending the Constitution. Defending America. Why it matters now more than ever. Joshua Phillip, presenter of America Rewritten, hosts an in-person panel discussion in the heart of New York City. With special guests Alan Dershowitz, Rob Nadelson, Timothy Barton, Kevin Roberts, Pastor Che Ahn, and Rex Steniger. Listen to these 6 law experts and rights defenders who have taken courageous steps to preserve the U.S. Constitution. For one night only. Live streaming on Epoch TV. So sign up today. Help us defend the Constitution and defend America.
Check, check, check. All right. Hello, everybody. As the video said, sign up today, but you have already signed up, so there's no signing up, any more signing up needed. So welcome. If anybody else needs to take a seat, you can do so now. So welcome to the first event in our Defending America series, the first event, right? And for tonight, for this evening, I'm going to be your host. I'm Roman from the Epoch Times, and I'd like to welcome you to this first event. Thank you. Also, I would like to just say thank you all for being subscribers to the Epoch Times and joining us on this long, long journey of exploring everything, all this politics, all this craziness through the lens of truth and tradition. Actually, myself and a lot of the reporters who are sitting here, we sort of just have our heads down in the grindstone and the books and the reports and the research. So it's really just a great opportunity to meet you guys who are actually reading and watching the content. So that's really awesome. And actually, before we begin tonight, I'd like to give a quick shout out to all of the staff in the back. They're the ones dressed in black. Yeah, please. They're awesome. They spent about 2 months putting together all the logistics, all the guest list, and all the beautiful banners and everything. So, well done. Now, I did mention that this is the first event in the Defending America series because, as you likely know, America is getting assaulted in a variety of ways. It's not just through one dimension that America is getting attacked. There's the breakdown of the school system, right, all the way down, from the university level down to the elementary school level, with critical race theory even being taught to 5- and 6-year-olds, as you likely know. And the communist ideology and all of its different manifestations and, in ways that it's called, it might not be called communism, but it ultimately is communism. It has pretty much infiltrated all of the institutions in America in one shape, form, or another. So throughout the course of this evening, we will have experts on the Constitution come up and speak. We're going to have a panel discussion, and then afterwards, we're actually going to change it up. We're going to turn it around and have you ask questions. So if you have any questions, we'll have a Q&A. If you have any questions now or as any questions come up, you can ask any of our speakers at the end, towards the end of the event. Now, before we begin, I would like to take a quick opportunity to have you guys turn your phones on silent. That way, just in case you get that important text, it doesn't throw the person who's speaking off and they will lose their place. And now, to officially kick off the event, I would like to introduce the publisher of the Epoch Times, Mr. Stephen Gregory.
Thank you, Roman, and good evening and welcome to you all. America is in crisis. We have seen the shock troops of socialism burn our cities. Black Lives Matter says it has a racial agenda. Antifa has an agenda of anarchy. They both are socialist. Police departments have been under attack, and crime is going up rapidly. Our election laws have been perverted to enable cheating. And with lightning speed, as Roman mentioned, critical race theory has taken over our schools. Our children are taught that race, not character, is the most important thing. At the same time, critical race theory is being taught in government, in our military, and in corporations. Division and hatred are being sown. Censorship has somehow become a standard practice, as social media and many of the corporate media won't just decide what we can know and what we can say. And recent news suggests our government is encouraging this censorship. Some of our national politicians are now openly calling for a socialist agenda, and the Chinese Communist Party continues to use every means at its disposal to subvert our nation and to challenge us abroad. Taken together, these developments are an attempt to jerk America off of its moorings, to fundamentally transform this country, to make it into something unrecognizable. Just reading out this list makes me feel a little bit shocked. In fact, one sees some signs of shock and paralysis and a feeling of helpless anger among many of our American citizens. In the face of this onslaught, it's natural to feel a little bit overwhelmed. But if we are feeling a little overwhelmed, we need to take a step back, gather ourselves, and begin to act for what we know is right. We need to calmly resolve to restore America. In embarking on this effort, we need to keep a few things in mind. First, truth and nature are on our side. We have over 200 years of experience of the United States increasingly fulfilling the promise of its founding, providing liberty and equality for all. We have, all things considered, been the freest, most just, most prosperous, and most secure nation on the face of the earth. Ours is a project of reclaiming what is successful, not inventing new forms, not inventing new understandings. Second, the American people, no matter what you hear, are on our side. The dangerous innovations advanced in this past year are not popular. The American people, left or right, do not want their police defunded and dishonored. They do not want racial hatred taught into their children. They want elections to be honest. They want open debate, not censorship. Third, most of those who oppose America as founded do so not out of ill will, but out of their being influenced by bad information. Our task is to remind all the American people of the case to be made for our country. Tonight, we consider the case to be made for our Constitution, which is the citadel of America's greatness. If America's enemies finally undermine it, they will have succeeded in transforming our country. That is why we begin our discussion of defending America with the topic of the Constitution. I'd like to briefly highlight its connection to our national character. We think of the Constitution as a legal document. It's got checks and balances. It limits federal power. All of these things, of course, are extremely important. But because it secures individual liberty and because it secures equality, it has put a seal on our national character. Edmund Burke, trying to prevent Britain's war against the colonies, warned his countrymen that America was a very vigorous, a very enterprising, a very energetic place. What I'm saying is the Constitution put a seal on that national character. We can see this by comparing it to socialism. Socialism encourages individuals to depend on an all-supervising government, and so it encourages passivity and dependence. Socialism teaches that society is divided into the oppressors and the oppressed, and so people learn to look with envy or fear on their fellow citizens. And socialism puts the government in place of all other relations, including with God, and so it teaches atheism. By contrast, the freedom and equality secured in the United States encourage energy, encourage enterprise, ambition, hope, and generosity, and they make room for the faithful to worship God. Our country was founded by people coming here to exercise that first freedom. But at this moment, the momentum, or at least the loudest voices, seem to favor socialism and censorship. To change this situation, We need to give courage and hope to the friends of the United States, and that is what this series is all about. We need to open the door to those who, out of ignorance, have been swept up by the forces opposing this country. We shouldn't be too impressed by some of the opposition to America that we see right now. On the one hand, on the TV news every night, we see young people with very strong passions. On the other hand, the degree of their ignorance is staggering. We will test whether good ideas, delivered in the first person, delivered by friends and neighbors and family, can over time drive out bad ideas. I say, let's not be too concerned about all of the silliness out there, because, as I say, it's silliness. It can change. Americans need to remember why their nation is great. They need to understand and feel the basic goodness of the United States. And so the task before us is one of education. We need to encourage Americans to learn the truth about their country, not the propaganda that's so common. If ordinary Americans spread the word, and this becomes a grassroots effort, it'll be very powerful, as Americans remind other Americans about the truth about our country. Informed Americans will be immune to any appeal socialism may have, and they will support policy choices that are in line with America's good. The key thing is for people to have that basic understanding. After our presentations tonight, we'll say a few words about how to get this started. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Stephen. And now, with that introduction, let's dive right into the first speech of the evening with a topic that I think a lot of you will enjoy. The topic is how the Constitution is currently under attack by the left. And the first speaker is someone that you might recognize. He is an attorney. He is an expert on the U.S. Constitution. He taught at Harvard for 50 years. I thought it was 49, but he corrected me. It's 50. Half of his cases are pro bono. He takes them pro bono. And more recently, he was one of President Trump's attorneys during his first impeachment trial. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Mr. Alan Dershowitz.
Thank you very much. You might ask yourself, what is a liberal Democrat, agnostic, doing up here talking to you about freedom of speech and the First Amendment? I don't think you have to be a conservative to really understand and love the Constitution and freedom of speech. I think conservatives should and do, but so should genuine liberals. And whether, as Thomas Jefferson said, whether my nephew believes in God or not is as relevant as whether he believes in Euclidean geometry in terms of his character. And so I'm here to talk to you from a perspective different from your own on some matters, but similar on others. You know, it used to be so easy to be a First Amendment advocate who believed in free speech and the marketplace of ideas. Why was it so easy? Because back in the day, the First Amendment supported free speech. The First Amendment protected free speech. Today, the First Amendment is being used as a sword by big tech, by universities, and by some progressives to constrain free speech. The big tech is claiming they have the right to censor under the First Amendment. The First Amendment gives them the right to censor. Can you imagine Madison and Jefferson sitting around and wondering what words to use in the First Amendment? And somebody said, well, what if they use the First Amendment to close down the marketplace of ideas, to shut down debate, to censor? The founders of our Constitution would say that's absurd. The First Amendment was intended as a mechanism for making sure the marketplace of ideas is kept open. But today, that's not the case. Today, Facebook and Twitter and YouTube say They have the right to censor. They have the right to take the President of the United States and the ex-president off their platforms at the same time that they promote Reverend Farrakhan and the head of Iran and repression in China and all kinds of other repressive measures. They're okay on our platforms, but we have the right to censor the president. Not only the president. I have been taken down. How was I taken down? I debated Bobby Kennedy about vaccines and about whether or not vaccination should be compelled. We had a wonderful debate, and it was an hour long. We have somewhat different views on vaccination. People watched it. YouTube took it down. They said, we're okay with you listening to Dershowitz, but we don't want you to hear Kennedy. And I said, no, that's not going to happen. This was a debate. Either we both stay up or we both go down. They took us both down, and we went on Rumble. You can now read us on Rumble. But censorship, the appetite of the censor knows no limits. If you give them the power to censor, they'll take more and more and more and more. That's why Facebook's idea, let's create a Supreme Court of censorship. Good people, decent people, progressives, liberals, conservatives. No. When you give people the power to censor, they then, if you don't censor, they think that you're permitting it to go forward. I'll tell you a story. A long time ago, I went to Madrid for the Helsinki Accords on human rights, and I was there on behalf of the United States, and I debated this was the Soviet Union days, a Soviet Union lawyer. And we were talking about a range of things, and I said to him, you know, in the Soviet Union, there's an enormous amount of anti-Semitism, and I showed him some brochures and leaflets that were anti-Semitic, and he's a very smart guy. He took out of his briefcase leaflets from the United States that were even worse from the Nazi Party. And I said, you're absolutely right, they are worse, but I want you to look at one thing that's different. And I held up for the audience to see the Soviet material. And all the Soviet material had a stamp on it, approved by Glovelet, the Soviet censorship agency, whereas the American Nazi material was just approved by the Nazi Party. And that was the difference. If the government censors, that what it doesn't censor, it approves of. And that's the terrible message that YouTube and Twitter are sending. Say the Supreme Court says we're not going to censor certain material, or we're going to censor certain material. Then what they don't censor, they've approved. And we don't want Supreme Courts unelected, unappointed, unaccountable to tell us what's approved and what's not approved. We have the intelligence to make that decision. Again, Jefferson, give me a philosopher or a plowman, I'll take the plowman in terms of his intelligence and his ability to decide what he wants to hear and what he wants to read and who he wants to vote for. And we shouldn't be allowing elitists to determine what we read, what we see, and what we hear. And so I'm very worried about the high-tech approach. And that's why President Trump's lawsuit is such an important one. I don't know whether he's going to win or not. There are cases going both ways on this. There's Marsh versus Alabama. Some of you may know that case. It involved a private company that set up a little company town where its employees could live. And it had a grocery store, and it had a little shopping mall, and then a hardware store. And but it was a private town owned by a private company. And a Jehovah's Witness came in and said, I want to preach my gospel. Hey, no, this is a private town. We don't want you here. The Jehovah's Witness took it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled that because the town was like a government, it partook of government, it related to people as if it was government, they were covered by the First Amendment. That's a case that helps President Trump, former President Trump. And there's a case that hurts him, Miami Herald. The Miami Herald case, the state of Florida passed a statute, perfectly reasonable statute, saying if a politician is attacked in the editorial pages of a newspaper, the newspaper has an obligation to print the letter by the politician responding. Miami Herald said, no, you can't tell us what to print. And the Supreme Court agreed and said, you're the Miami Herald. You print what you want to print. You don't print what you don't want to print. But there's a big difference between the Miami Herald and Facebook, obviously. The Miami Herald is one among many newspapers, even one among many newspapers in South Florida. Whereas, obviously, the three giants of high tech dominate the market today. They also have the benefit of Section 230 of the Decency and Communications Act. Section 230 gives the high tech platforms a special exemption. They can't be sued for defamation. So they're already being regulated by the government. They welcome that regulation. Thank you, government. Please regulate us. Immunize us. Tell us we can't be sued, but don't tell us what we can print and what we can't print. Well, you know, I'm not sure the courts will say you can have it both ways. Justice Thomas has already indicated, maybe, he's not sure, the other justices aren't sure, maybe high tech is a common carrier, like the telegraph company, or like buses and trains, and maybe they can't refuse to serve people. Maybe they have to serve everybody, and they can't say, yes, we'll serve Democrats, but not Republicans. Yes, we'll serve Biden, but we won't serve Trump. So that's going to be a really interesting case. And when I said on television I thought it was a really important case, all my left-wing colleagues attacked me. This is ridiculous. This is the stupidest case ever. Well, you know, they've been wrong about almost everything they've predicted. So let's wait. Let's wait and see. And speaking of my colleagues, now we have universities, which are no longer places that teach you how to think. They try to teach you what to think. You know, I taught for 50 years at Harvard. I was one of the most popular teachers. I taught a course called Taboo with Steven Pinker. We taught about subjects that nobody wants to talk about in college, race and gender and other things. We had 900 students. You're right, the American people are not on the side of censorship if you just give them the choice. Harvard students were not on the side of censorship. They rallied to a course called Taboo. They wanted to hear a discussion about things they can't discuss in other classes. And students want open-minded conversations. There's always 5, 10, 15, sometimes 20, sometimes 25% of the student body that doesn't want to hear things they don't agree with. They are deeply offended. They don't feel safe. Well, you're not supposed to feel safe in a university for your ideas. Your ideas are supposed to be challenged. You're supposed to feel physically safe. And I have to tell you, pro-Israel Zionists on campus don't feel physically safe today on some campuses. But students who express radical views are very safe. My friend Ron Sullivan, who was the first African-American dean of a college at Harvard, was fired essentially from his job because he had dared to defend Harvey Weinstein, the great, pariah. And when you start firing people for who they represent, as I said, if John Adams had been teaching at Harvard when he represented the people who were charged with the Boston Massacre, would they have fired him? Well, some of those folks, if they had heard of John Adams, probably would have tried to fire him. When I was invited to speak at Harvard recently, again, 50 years, they had to move my speech off campus because it was going to be disrupted and efforts were going to be made to stop me from speaking. When I tried to speak at Berkeley a couple of years ago, they established a new rule. They said, if you're sponsored by a department, you can speak. But if you're not sponsored by an official department, you have to give 8 weeks' notice. 8 weeks' notice means the end of the semester. It's gone. So I went to every department, and I said, sponsor me. We're not sponsoring you. We'll sponsor Noam Chomsky. We'll sponsor Norman Finkelstein. We'll sponsor AOC. We're not sponsoring you. So I immediately threatened to bring a federal lawsuit, saying that was de facto discrimination. And fortunately, the dean of the law school stepped up and said, all right, we'll invite you. And so they invited me. I had 1,000 students came. People crowded to hear the talk. They want to hear it. Antifa tried to stop it. but they couldn't. So universities are a real problem today. And progressives, they call themselves progressives. They're regressives. They're Stalinists. They are trying to go back to a time when people in power determined who gets to talk and who doesn't get to talk. Even the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU now stands for Anti-Civil Liberties Union. They argued that President Trump could be impeached for a speech he made in Washington. I heard every word of that speech. Every word of that speech was protected by the First Amendment. The ACLU should have been protecting President Trump instead of calling for his impeachment. Look, I was a board member of the ACLU when Nixon was impeached. I favored Nixon's impeachment. I believe that Nixon had committed high crimes and misdemeanors, obstruction of justice, etc. But I persuaded the ACLU to come in and defend his procedural rights, to make sure every I was dotted, every constitutional T was crossed. Today you couldn't get the ACLU to do that. The ACLU has a litmus test. If it's pro-Trump, we don't do it. If it's anti-Trump, we do it. And that's not what the American Civil Liberties Union should be about. The marketplace of ideas has to remain open, and the First Amendment has to be used to pry open that marketplace of ideas even when others would shut it down. And today we're experiencing left-wing McCarthyism. I have to become personal here. So I've been living in Chilmark, Massachusetts for the summer for 53 years. I first went to Martha's Vineyard because a guy called me and asked me to represent him. He said somebody that he is working for just drove off a bridge with a woman in the car, and would I come and defend Senator Ted Kennedy? And so I did. And that was my first trip to Martha's Vineyard, and that was 1969. And I've been going back ever since. And for years, I was called the mayor of Chilmark. Chilmark is a small town in Massachusetts with a lot of writers, Hollywood types, and people from the left. I was the mayor of Chilmark. Every day I would sit on the porch of the Chilmark store, and I would tell stories, and I would tell jokes, and people would come. And I was highly respected, and I was invited by the library every year to speak. Today in Chilmark, nobody will speak to me. People whose children I helped at 3 o'clock in the morning when they were arrested for drunken driving or drugs. People whose kids got thrown out of high school or college. People who wanted help getting into college. I helped to represent them. Today, not only won't they speak to me, they won't speak to my wife. Talk about McCarthyism. My wife didn't even want me to represent Donald Trump. She was opposed to it, but they won't speak to her. So when this kind of McCarthyism by association, guilt by association, was brought to their attention, they said, oh, no, we're opposed to Carolyn, my wife, because she laughed at a joke told by Donald Trump, and they produced a videotape. What happened was this. My wife and I were invited to the White House to watch the rollout of the Camp David Accords. I was one of those who worked on the Camp David Accords, and so I was invited both by the President and the Prime Minister of Israel to come to the White House to see the rollout of the Accords, which was one of the most important things in the 21st century. And Trump got up and commented on the fact that Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, was there, and that he had a run-in with a reporter from NPR, and he joked about it. And my wife, who comes from Charleston, South Carolina, and therefore is the most polite person in the history of the world, smiled. You can see her on television. She goes, she didn't think it was a funny joke, but she smiled. That has become the reason why she is now a victim of left-wing McCarthyism on Martha's Vineyard. I mean, Chilmark was a place that was very seriously hurt by real McCarthyism of the 1940s and 1950s because it had a lot of left-wing writers, a lot of Hollywood screenwriters, blacklists, television, red channels. And now the people, the children and the grandchildren of the people who were subject to McCarthyism of the right have become the McCarthyists of the left. And it's such a dangerous, dangerous, dangerous phenomenon. And so we see almost everybody failing the shoe on the other foot test. That is, if the shoe were on the other foot, what would they be doing? Take, for example, and I only have a couple of more minutes, critical race theory. So I know all about critical race theory because it was invented by my former colleague, Derek Bell, who was a professor at Harvard, a very brilliant African-American professor. He invented the concept. It's total nonsense, but he invented it. It views everything in American history through the lens of race. There's nothing that can't be seen without looking at it in racial matters. And it distorts American history terribly. And so a couple of states, probably ill-advisedly, Florida, have passed statutes saying you cannot teach critical race theory to captive students under the age of whatever and teach them that all white people are terrible and white people are responsible for all the problems of the world, and et cetera, et cetera. You can't do that. And so a bunch of people, including New York Times and others, have said, it's terrible for the state legislature to be passing laws telling teachers what they can teach and what they can't teach. Sounds plausible, but imagine if the shoe were on the other foot. If somebody passed a statute saying you cannot teach that black people are racially inferior. You cannot teach that immigrants are, whatever. You cannot teach these terrible things which are false. These same liberals would be saying, that's absolutely wonderful. That's the best thing that ever happened. So it's not that they're objecting to the fact that legislatures are telling teachers what they can teach. It's that they don't like what they say they can't teach, but if it was something else, they would come up with a completely different view. I think that's very, very typical of what's going on. I'm looking forward to your questions and to the comments and to the exchange of views. I just want to end with what I think one of the greatest judges in American history. His name was Learned Hand. He's the greatest judge who was never a Supreme Court justice. A very conservative man, but a man who understood liberty. And he wrote a book called The Spirit of Liberty. And he said, when the spirit of liberty dies in the hearts of men and women, there's nothing the law can do to revive it. Pointing to Germany, Weimar Germany had wonderful laws, but the spirit of liberty died in the hearts of the people of Germany. And he said, but when the spirit of liberty survives, nothing can stop us from being a great nation. And our job here today, and your job, the Epoch Times, and those of you who are very supportive, your job is to keep the spirit of liberty alive, to make sure that whatever the progressives say, whatever the universities say, whatever big tech says, you will guarantee that the spirit of liberty remains alive. And I join you in that quest. I join you in a quest which the people who wrote the Constitution of the United States back all those many years ago, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the 14th Amendment, would applaud and would join us in fighting against the forces of repression. So thank you again for inviting me.
Check. All right. Alan, thank you so much. That was a phenomenal speech. And again, he will be available for the Q&A later after the panel discussion. Now, I notice some people are coming in. Thank you for waiting during the speech. You guys can take a seat now. And so our next speaker will explore a very important question, a great follow-up question to Alan's speech, the question of why the Constitution is worth defending. And you might actually recognize our next speaker, at least by name, if you are a regular reader of the Epoch Times, because he publishes several pieces every single month, which often explore the meaning, the true meaning behind the Constitution. And by doing that, pretty much every week his writings do educate hundreds of thousands of people and have been for the last several months about the true meaning and value of the Constitution. And so this man has already been defending America. And so this man, he is a former constitutional law professor. His research on the true meaning of the Constitution has been cited repeatedly by both Supreme Court justices as well as by the people who are actually arguing in the Supreme Court repeatedly. And he is the author of a phenomenal book called The Original Constitution, What It Actually Said and Meant. Ladies and gentlemen, I introduce Rob Nadelson.
I have the worst job of the evening. I have to follow Alan Dershowitz. Before I go any further, I don't know how many people know this, but this whole first in a series event was organized by a very wonderful woman named Ruby Wong, and I think we should recognize her and say, come out here, Ruby, and give her a hand. Thank you. I've been told 20 minutes. 20 minutes tops, and I've got a lot to say. So I'm going to do something which I normally don't do, and that is I'm going to actually read a speech to you. And hopefully we can get it all within the 20 minutes. I think before we make a decision as to whether to defend the U.S. Constitution, we need to ask ourselves whether the U.S. Constitution is worth defending. There clearly are many people today, especially in the commanding heights of our society, big media, big tech, the elite colleges and foundations, big government, big business, who think it is not worth defending. But they are wrong. They're not only wrong, they're grossly and tragically wrong. You can think of many reasons for their error. Maybe it's short-sightedness, intolerance, political expediency, financial interest, historical and constitutional ignorance. But whatever the reason, the important point is they're wrong. The Constitution has served us not only well, but brilliantly. And to the extent that it still survives, it continues to serve us brilliantly. Tonight, I'm going to offer you 5 reasons why I think this is so, and I'm going to start with a summary of them. First, with one significant exception, the Constitution has enabled us to avoid war among the American states. Second, by limiting the authority of the central government and providing that most powers are exercised elsewhere, the Constitution has provided the structure necessary to preserve freedom and ensure astonishing human progress. Third, the Constitution's Bill of Rights and other protections for liberty have provided additional support for human freedom. Fourth, the Constitution represents a judicious balancing of interests, and I'll explain that later. Fifth, the Constitution's amendment process has provided the flexibility necessary for responding to structural problems, both old and new. Now, let's go through all 5 one by one. First, on the issue of war. Since the Constitution was adopted, the United States has enjoyed a long history of peace among the states, broken only once. We all take this for granted. But to the founders, war among the states and resulting foreign intervention was a very real possibility and a very real threat. And by the way, when I use the word founders, I don't just mean the drafters of the Constitution. I'm including in this class the 1,648 people who ratified the document and everyone, male or female, who played a significant role in the constitutional debates of 1787 to 1790. As I said, the founders understood the risk of disunion. In disunited Europe, the previous 150 years had witnessed about 70 wars, and that doesn't count rebellions. The results were horrific. The 30 Years' War alone may have killed upwards of 8 million people. The War of the Austrian Succession resulted in perhaps 500,000 casualties. The 7 Years' War caused perhaps 1 million. And I haven't even given you the tally for the other 67 conflicts. Our founders knew the United States would eventually be a very large country. In 1787, it already was a very large country, and they were determined to avoid the bloody fate of Europe. They decided to create a central government that was strong enough and popular enough to ensure peace. This need for union was one of the reasons that they had to compromise with slavery, which, contrary to common mythology, most of the founders opposed. Throughout all but 4 of the subsequent 232 years, the Constitution has assured unity and the peace that has come with it. I don't need to remind you, any of you, what the record of disunited Europe has been in that period. On the other hand, the founders also understood that a free government fit to span a continent could not be a centralized government. They knew that the political system had to be sufficiently flexible to accommodate the needs and desires of different people, different cultures, different localities, different preferences. They knew that there had to be some check from below on the central power of the federal government. So they adopted a document that granted enough authority to the central government to keep the peace and to smooth out some of the bumps. And by the way, I don't mean that they smoothed out all of the bumps. Some of them would have been too costly in terms of flexibility and human freedom to smooth out, but enough of them, while leaving control of the vast majority of human activities to states, local governments, private associations, families, and individuals. Thus, the second of the Constitution's great contributions is federalism, or more generally, decentralization. It's a remarkable fact that many of the world's eras of explosive human progress have come in political environments of decentralization, even extreme decentralization. The awakening of the human intellect in fragmented ancient Greece, the quickening of trade and culture and rule of law and rise of living standards in the early Roman Empire, the flowering of arts and commerce in Renaissance Italy and Germany, the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution in relatively decentralized England, and the economic and technological takeoffs in 19th century Europe and America. Decentralization promotes creativity by allowing people to move to places that are best for them. Decentralization allows competition among states for creative talent. During the periods when the Constitution's constraints on federal authority were still honored, roughly 1789 to 1940, America not only became the world's greatest power, but a land of that explosive human progress. We, along with politically fragmented Europe, harnessed electricity, developed modern medicine, freed the slaves, emancipated women, and invented the telegraph, telephone, radio, television, railroad, automobile, and airplane. The modern world depends heavily on the progress made during the era of decentralization. So, the Constitution created a government strong enough to keep the peace, but weak enough to permit human flourishing. Let's turn to its third contribution, which is more familiar, the Bill of Rights and other protections for liberty. For technical legal reasons, most of the Constitution's drafters didn't think a Bill of Rights was necessary. They believed that the structure of the document already protected liberty. But Patrick Henry knew human nature, and Patrick Henry disagreed. He urged Americans not to be satisfied with constructive, argumentative rights. He said that ordinary people needed a list they could turn to, read, point to, and rely on. They needed a specific Bill of Rights. Patrick Henry was wrong about the Constitution in many ways, but he was correct about the Bill of Rights. It was not enough that the original document protected, say, freedom of speech by implication, if indeed it really did. Those and other fundamental freedoms needed to be written into the document. Recent events make us very grateful that they were. Peace, decentralization, the Bill of Rights, and other protections for human freedom. Now we come to the fourth contribution. This one is much more subtle. It's the Constitution's judicious and very successful accommodation and balancing of interests. In school, everybody learns, or used to learn, about the Great Compromise. Remember that? The Senate is allocated by states. The House of Representatives is mostly allocated by population. But there were far, far more compromises than that, and I'm not even sure the Great Compromise was really the greatest. The greatest might have been federalism, the middle ground between a unitary central government on the one side and a mere treaty organization like the Articles of Confederation on the other. But compromise, which was the greatest compromise, really isn't my point. My point is that the Constitution is loaded with compromises and accommodations, many based heavily on the lessons of history and what we would today call political science and public choice economics. For example, the Constitution's rules pertaining to the issuance of money represented a compromise. The terms of office for federal officials were a compromise. The grounds for impeachment formed a compromise between those who wanted impeachment for any reason and those favoring impeachment only for the most narrow of reasons. Incidentally, one of those grounds, high misdemeanors, was widely misunderstood during the Trump impeachment, but it was not misunderstood by Alan Dershowitz. The origination clause, requiring that tax measures be introduced first in the House of Representatives rather than in the Senate, was a particularly well thought out and very heavily debated compromise. The presidential election system with the Electoral College was yet another compromise, a carefully balanced plan adopted for numerous reasons of which most modern critics are blissfully unaware. The list goes on and on and on. But I'd like to illustrate one key compromise because it's a particularly important one, and that is how the Constitution handled the issue of religion. There were two polar positions that the founders could have adopted. One extreme would have been to create what modern advocates sometimes call the godless Constitution. This would have been a secular state of the kind French revolutionaries erected a few years later. There wasn't much support for this position because most people thought belief in God was necessary for self-governance. Tom Paine, a deist, might have liked it. And Thomas Jefferson, who most writers call a deist but was really more like a Unitarian, he maybe could have lived with it too, although that's debatable. But Paine and Jefferson were both in Europe during the constitutional debates, and contrary to what you might have heard, nearly all the other founders were Christians, not deists. The other extreme possibility from the godless Constitution was to emulate the governments of Britain and most of the states and create a constitution that, while tolerating other beliefs, was distinctly Christian. The founders didn't do this either. So what did they do? Most people investigating the subject have focused on the background of the First Amendment or statements by people like Jefferson or James Madison, which is fine up to a point. But I think you get a clearer history of the Constitution's religion settlement by looking at what happened or how, regarding two clauses in the original Constitution. One of these clauses required an oath for anyone taking office. And in the 18th century, you could not take an oath unless you believed in God. That was the law. And another of the Constitution's clauses banned religious tests for holding office. This was understood, as the South Carolina Ratifying Convention said, to mean that there were no religious tests other than a belief in God. The bottom line was that the founders compromised between sectarianism and secularism. They built the Constitution on theism, not on any particular religion or religions. There are many sources supporting this conclusion. Among others, they include a successful letter written to the Constitutional Convention by a leader of the Philadelphia Jewish congregation asking that religious tests not be put in the Constitution. During the celebrations over the Constitution's ratification, the organizers made every effort to make them as ecumenical as possible, including not just every Christian denomination, but the leader of the Jewish denominations as well. During the constitutional debates, opponents of the document assailed it precisely because it was non-sectarian. They argued that the Constitution should limit office holding to Christians. This drew powerful responses from the Constitution's advocates, including several Christian ministers. The gist of those responses was that belief in a God or gods was sufficient, and that good people were to be found in every religion. They referenced favorably not only Christians and Jews, but Muslims, Hindus, and adherents to what they called natural religion. The compromise thereby accommodated the belief that good citizenship should include recognition of a higher power, but that higher power was not specifically the God of any particular religion, but the God of all. For the first time ever, Americans of all faiths could be first-class citizens, fully able to participate in government with full freedom of religion. So far, I've mentioned the Constitution's contributions toward peace, decentralization, protection of individual rights, and judicious compromises. Now let's add the fifth one, and this is the amendment process. Surprising as it might seem, most earlier constitutional-style documents in the Anglo-American tradition had no provisions for amendment. But the framers knew that they were writing a constitution not just for a few years, but for the ages. So they inserted Article 5, which outlines the process for amendment. The records of the document's drafting and ratifications show that the founders had 4 reasons for including an amendment procedure. First, there might be drafting defects in the original document that merited correction. The founders were very great people, but part of their greatness was recognizing their own fallibility. Second, the Constitution is first and foremost a legal instrument. It is the supreme law of the land. The founders knew that any legal instrument must be interpreted, and that arguments over interpretation would inevitably arise. The amendment process could resolve those arguments. For example, if the public thought a Supreme Court opinion erroneously construed the Constitution, an amendment could correct the court. The founding generation did exactly this by adopting the 11th Amendment in 1795. A third reason for the amendment process was social change. The Industrial Revolution had begun, and the founders knew that technological and other developments might make part of the original Constitution obsolete. And finally, leading founders repeatedly prescribed the amendment process as a way to respond if government was abusive, overreaching, or dysfunctional. The founders proved prescient indeed, because later generations have adopted amendments for all 4 purposes. Unfortunately, little editorial comment, there have been times in American history where we have allowed bad situations to become worse because we failed to use the amendment process. In January 1861, for example, the Commonwealth of Virginia called a convention of the states to propose an amendment to try to head off the Civil War. The convention did, in fact, propose an amendment. I think that if that amendment had been ratified, it might have prevented the Civil War and also put slavery on a path to extinction. But because the 1861 convention had no official Article 5 status, it could not send the amendment to the states for ratification. So the convention sent it to Congress as well. What does Congress do best in a crisis? Nothing. So we eventually did adopt an amendment abolishing slavery, but 650,000 Americans had to die to win it. The lesson for today is obvious. Almost everyone agrees the federal government has become, at the very least, dysfunctional. Almost everyone agrees that decades of reform efforts have failed to correct or even ameliorate the damage. Almost everyone agrees that Congress will not propose constitutional amendments reforming itself. And every qualified scholar who has researched the issue in this century agrees that an amendments convention can be targeted at and limited to the necessary reforms. Yet year after year, we dither away our time rather than calling a convention, and the situation gets progressively worse. We have many reasons to celebrate our Constitution. It created a truly united states and gave us continental peace. It created a decentralized system consistent with human freedom and human thriving. It included specific protections for liberty, including, but not limited to, the Bill of Rights. It represented an extraordinary collection of judicious decisions on a wide range of topics. And because the framers understood their own limitations, the Constitution contains a procedure for amendment. Those, I submit, are some very good reasons why it is our duty and our privilege to defend the Constitution. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Rob. And again, Rob will also be available for the Q&A session afterwards. And now let's change up the format a little bit, because I know you guys have been noticing these empty chairs sitting here, and they've been empty for too long. So Joshua will be leading the discussion. So Joshua doesn't need much of an introduction, but I will still give him a short introduction, especially to regular readers of the Epoch Times. So Joshua is a senior investigative reporter with the Epoch Times. He's the host of Grassroots, which is a show on Epoch TV, and he is maybe one of the top 10 experts on the Chinese Communist Party's infiltration of the entire world and the communist subversion of America in particular. Josh, please come on up. And with him, and the panelists can come up as well. He will introduce them further, but we have Kevin Roberts, Tim Barton, Pastor Cheon, and Rex Steninger.
Well, folks, I don't need to repeat that our Constitution is under attack and that it is something very much worth defending, but here sitting with us are some folks defending it. And it's nice to hear some personal stories of what's actually happening on the ground, because there's actually a lot more to be hopeful than some people might think there is. So we have with us today Kevin Roberts. He's the CEO of Texas Public Policy Foundation. His organization is one of the main ones fighting back in Texas when it comes to politics against things like critical race theory and so on. We have Tim Barton, president of Wall Builders, and he has with us a good collection of books and documents, you might notice, which he'll be showing us. They have the largest private collection of founding documents in Texas. Well, whole the U.S., but they're based in Texas, and really fantastic work preserving American history. We have Pastor Cheon. He's with the Harvest Rock Church. You might remember his story. This was the pastor who, during the lockdowns, They fought it in the courts and won in the Supreme Court and got churches reopened. And at the end here we have Rex. And at the end here we have Rex Stedinger. He's the commissioner of Elko County, Nevada. And you might have heard about this county in Nevada that went constitutional. That's his county. And so we're going to hear what that means tonight. And that's let's start with Rex, actually. I was wondering if you could tell us, what does it mean to be a constitutional county?
Is this on? Okay.
Yeah.
It just means that we've followed the Constitution. We're going to start pushing back about any law that comes down that violates the Constitution. And it really comes ahead after the year of the pandemic when they told us we had to stay in our houses. We had to not associate with our friends. We had to close our churches and things like that.
Yeah. So you could hold the mic a little closer to your mouth.
Okay.
Perfect.
That
There we go. There we go. Perfect. Yeah, well, I can imagine, too, there's going to be some battles in the courts. Are you prepared for this? I mean, making a declaration like that is interesting because on some levels, counties might not have the power, but at the same time, you are still protected by the Constitution, and saying you're going to stand by the Constitution.
Yeah, I expect we will have some pushback, but I always fall back, and we took an oath of office to protect and defend the Constitution, so I feel we're on pretty solid ground.
Yeah, great. Pastor Shayon, now, I'm curious if you could tell us your church's story during the lockdowns. How did this all begin?
We'll have to give some context because my father is also a Baptist pastor, Southern Baptist pastor. I'm not a Baptist pastor, but my dad was the first Korean Southern Baptist pastor in North America, immigrated here in 1958. He was born in Pyongyang, what is now the capital of North Korea. And when communists took over in 1945, one of the things that Kim Il-sung, the grandfather of Kim Jong-un, did was arrest pastors under communism. And he was arrested, and the only reason why he escaped was because of the U.S. forces that intervened in 1950 under Truman and under General MacArthur. And so I want to thank all the U.S. forces. I want to thank the Americans twice, because you send missionaries to Korea in 1880, Protestant missionaries, evangelical missionaries. And my great-grandmother came to know the Lord because of that, out of darkness into marvelous light. And since then, we've had generation of followers of Jesus Christ. And so my dad's a pastor, I'm a pastor, my son is a pastor. And so 3 generations in a relatively short time when you think of how young Protestant Christianity is. But what happened is that when Truman came and entered into the war with MacArthur had this brilliant Incheon strategy of coming in south of what is now North Korea and was able to push the North Korean communist forces to the Chinese border, releasing millions of people that migrated to the south. My father was released from prison, and he was able to come down south, met my mom at Yongnam Presbyterian Church, and here I am as a result of that. So the point is, it's in my DNA. And so my dad hated communism. And a lot of times, unless we understand what communism is all about, you really can't really understand why some of the people that are taking a stand for freedom and First Amendment rights are doing so. And so when the lockdown took place in California, for me, it was a no-brainer, because I believe the church has been essential for 2,000 years, and Governor Newsom declared the church is not essential. Abortion clinics are essential, marijuana dispensaries are essential, but the church is not. He did open up for 1 month, but even the 1 month when he opened up, he said no singing or chanting. You talk about not interfering with the free exercise thereof. He's telling us how to worship. But Newsom is not the head of the church. Jesus is the head of the church. And we said we're going to worship, we're going to praise God, and give him the glory and honor due him. And so then after a month and 2 weeks, he locked down the church again. But I said, we're not going to lock down. So I called my attorney, Matt Staver of Liberty Counsel, and I said, I just want you to cover me because I'm going to go ahead. We're going to continue to meet. And he said, not only should you meet, but pray about suing Governor Newsom. And to be honest with you, it was a no-brainer. I said, we're going to sue him, and we sued him. The next month, I get a letter from the city prosecutor of Pasadena. It was a very dark, nasty letter saying that we're going to come and arrest you. This is a real letter. We want to prepare you. You're going to be arrested. You'll be in jail for 1 year. And we're going to fine your church members $1,000 for every meeting that they've been meeting, and we've been meeting since Pentecost Sunday, May 31st. And then the last paragraph, we reserve the right to arrest your church members. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm not in communist North Korea. I'm not in communist China. I'm in the United States of America, and we're talking about law-abiding citizens who just want to worship Jesus. These are people who pay their taxes. They're not. And the crazy irony is that Newsom was releasing prisoners because of COVID crowdedness, and yet he wanted to arrest us. And so I called my attorney. We asked for an emergency injunction just to protect me, and one thing led to, of course, the Supreme Court picked up on this. And by God's grace, by February the 5th, they ruled 6-3, which was a shocker because even John Roberts sided with us that this was a violation of the Constitution. And we won. And the exclamation point, again, to God's glory, we settled with a $1.35 million settlement. And it's now a permanent injunction. California can never lock down their church in perpetuity. In perpetuity. And so I think we have to realize that the government has gone so woke, progressively left. I believe in liberal, but I don't believe in this extreme left because they don't honor the First Amendment, and this is the supreme law of the land. So thank you so much for supporting us in our fight to defend our First Amendment rights.
Now, Kevin Roberts, I know in Texas you've been doing quite a bit too, and one of the big things you've been recently working on is critical race theory, and based on the constitutional grounds of it. Can you explain to some of the work you've been doing?
Sure. You know, the context quickly is that in Texas, perhaps more than most other states, you've noticed, we live out the American dream very profoundly. And it isn't because, in spite of what the two Texans on the stage might tell you, we're better than you are. It's because we teach our history well. And we teach it well and celebrate something that's really important. It's implied in the wonderful presentations by Professors Dershowitz and Nadelson. And that is, in spite of the great pluralism of the United States, which also is profound in Texas, diverse in every respect, not just since statehood and, that 9 years we were an independent nation, but 300 years even before that, very, very diverse peoples. We believe that very diverse, pluralistic peoples can get along. And the left doesn't want us to acknowledge that. Unfortunately, speaking as a recovering academic, I'm a historian of African American history, in spite of obvious circumstances. I'm a white guy who's a conservative Christian. I taught it happily. Why? Because we ought to be able to celebrate everything about this country, and unfortunately there are very few members of the academic left like Professor Dershowitz left. That is to say, very few remaining of them who are intellectually honest like he is, and God bless him for being who he is. That's America. Critical race theory, in spite of all of the beauty there, in spite of recognizing all of that great diversity and pluralism, would define us in the most ridiculous of ways. And that is according to the color of our skin. And if you think, I speak now as a historian, if you think of all of the worst episodes in history, that's the kind of definition that is used not just to divide people, but to provoke violence. And so in Texas, our legislature did, as 23 other state legislatures did, they stood athwart history, to paraphrase Will Buckley, and said, no, we're not buying into this. We still love this country. We're not going to teach 5-year-old children of color to hate their 5-year-old friends who are white, or vice versa. We are going to disallow it because it's our money and our kids and our future.
Tim Barton, I know you have some books and documents with you. Now, I'm curious if you could tell us, I guess first off, why is it important to defend the real history of America? Of course, we're just talking about teaching history to kids. Why is it important? What does real history teach us?
One of the things that was pointed out already in the presentations by the professors, the realized experience of Pastor Che. We are seeing right now a redefining of what the Constitution is. In front of our eyes, we're seeing judges literally legislating from the bench, which the founding fathers were very clear. That's not the role of the judiciary. That's not their branch. When we forget our history, we forget that there's so many lessons we have already learned along the way that we are now reliving. America already tried socialism. We tried it twice, Jamestown and Plymouth. And both times was a miserable failure. When you know your history, you realize some very basic fundamentals about things that you don't need to relive and relearn the hard way. In fact, this is a 3-volume set from James Wilson, who is one of only 6 guys to sign the Declaration and the Constitution. George Washington then appointed him to the U.S. Supreme Court. And while he was on the U.S. Supreme Court, he taught one of the very first law schools in America. And these are actually, they took his lectures from law school and they turned them into law books in 1804. But while he was a Supreme Court justice, he was teaching law school, and during his courses at law school, one of the things he told his students is that the reason we instituted the government we did in America was to bring a new security for the rights that God had already given us. When we look, for example, in the Constitution, the reason that there were advocates in favor of a Bill of Rights, and as was already pointed out, there were many founding fathers that said we don't need a Bill of Rights because the Constitution gives specific enumerated powers to the federal government, and they can only do the things the Constitution tells them they can do. And there were other founding fathers who said, yeah, but we know what people do when they get power, and we know they tend to go too far. We need to have a limitation of things they can never touch with the Bill of Rights. And it's interesting, what James Wilson told his law students is the reason we enshrined things like the Bill of Rights was to have a different level of security in America. So unlike what had happened in Europe, unlike under the kings, where the king didn't recognize the right of the individual, those God-given inalienable rights, he said to his law students in America, we have protected those in our Constitution. And the reason that's important to remember historically is because if we remembered the point and purpose of the First Amendment, no churches would have been shut down in the midst of COVID. We forgot what the federal government's role was. And when the founding fathers in the Declaration, they said that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. The reason government exists is to protect our God-given rights. When we forget history, we forget even the purpose of government, and therefore we give power to government to do things that they were never supposed to do in the first place.
Thank you. I know you brought a very interesting document. If you watch my show, you might have seen it, and I asked him to bring it today, which is one of the original drafts of the Declaration of Independence. So tell us about this first, and specifically, because we're just talking about critical race theory, this really debunks critical race theory.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And actually, you can get online, and you can go back and you can read Jefferson's original draft. When Thomas Jefferson, he and John Adams both died on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And in 1826, when he dies, they go and they begin collecting his writings. And in 1828, his writings are released, and the original draft of the Declaration was included in his writings. They took the original draft, and there's 4 pages. I'll open up this next 2 pages in a second. They took those 4 pages. They did essentially like an ink lift is what they did. They made a copy of it, and from that copy, they made several copies. This is one of the original copies that was made in 1829 of Jefferson's original draft of the Declaration. What's super fun about this is there's actually places where there's lines that marks out what is there, and on the side, it actually has the name of the person who did the edit. So this is Dr. Franklin, this is Mr. Adams, so it's kind of like a Google Doc or a Word document, right? You're going through and you mark who has the edits. What's really interesting is as you go through this document, it highlights, first of all, what we were doing in wanting to separate from Great Britain. And a lot of people today, because we don't know very much history, we've kind of lost the context of why we even did the Declaration. And really, the way we ought to think about the Declaration was this was the greatest breakup letter that was ever written. We told somebody it's not us, it's all you. And then we listed all the reasons why the king was the problem. What's super interesting is on page 3 of his original draft, when he goes through the grievances, the longest grievance on page 3 is a grievance against slavery. And he says the king has taken people from a continent, brought them across the Great Sea to a new continent where he has sold them into slavery. And Jefferson points out that he has struck down every one of our legislative attempts to stop this. And this Christian king, and he underlines the word Christian, right, almost like air quotes, like this so-called Christian king has kept open a market where he has enslaved men. And what's so interesting about this is when he gets to men right here, it is the only thing in the entire document that is fully capitalized, capital M, capital E, capital N. The only other thing in the document fully capitalized is the United States of America. Now, why this matters is there are literal people who argue today the Declaration of Independence, when Jefferson said that all men are created equal, he was only talking about the white men. Go back and read his original draft, because he emphasized who he was talking about, who these men were. Jefferson contrary to what a lot is told today, Jefferson actually advocated against slavery most of his life, that a lot of people have no idea. But even what's super interesting is when this draft goes to the Continental Congress, and they're going to approve it, John Hancock said that they could only accept what was unanimous. He said, if it's not unanimous, the king's going to pull us apart in our different directions, so it has to be unanimous. Jefferson said there were 2 colonies that actually opposed that grievance, and it was Georgia and South Carolina. And he says at the time, they said that they had not yet tried to end slavery, and so that wasn't a grievance for them. But here's what's so interesting. 11 of the 13 colonies agreed with ending slavery at that point. So when we hear things like critical race theory, and more specifically, we hear that America is systemically racist, that America was built on slavery, and America's fought for the institution of slavery. We had a Democrat senator last year in the U.S. Senate said that America didn't inherit slavery, we created the institution of slavery. Which, first of all, means he had the worst world history teacher ever to think that America created this, but it shows our historic ignorance, not recognizing that America actually has one of the most exceptional anti-slavery records in the history of the world. America signed the very first ever anti-slave trade law in March 2nd, 1807. England signed it March 25th. They signed it after we were the very first nation in the world to sign an anti-slave trade law. We were the 4th major nation in the world to actually end slavery, and we paid a higher price in ending slavery because of all the deaths lost in the Civil War. And in the world today, slavery is still a real thing. It's estimated there's more than 40 million people enslaved in the world today, and America is the #1 nation leading the fight against slavery in the world, which means America started earlier, paid a higher price, and still does more to oppose slavery today than any other nation in the world. But that history is being rewritten with things like critical race theory, with the 1619 Project. And so what we try to do is go back to original documents and say, wait a second, what you're saying is not actually true. Let's go back and see that Jefferson actually was against slavery. That's actually in the original draft of the Declaration. 11 of the 13 colonies supported ending slavery at that time. It's tragic that it took a civil war to end slavery in America, but even then, America was at the forefront of doing this. Again, it's stuff that the history is being taught in a very different method, which is why I am grateful to live in Texas, because we tend to do things a little different in Texas anyway. That's that Texas pride coming out a little bit. But it's why knowing history is so important, because it does help us overcome so many of those negative narratives today.
It really emphasizes, too, the importance of history, as you mentioned, because, if you know history, these things are so easy to debunk. The problem is a lot of kids these days, even a lot of adults, don't have any way of even learning this history. And so, again, brings back the point where we have our Defending America project. Now, on this note, too, another important point with all this is that actually even our form of government has changed quite a bit. And, we could do a whole panel just on this one. Our government's quite different than the Founding Fathers maybe intended it to be. And one of these big things is the growth of the administrative state. And Kevin Roberts, I was wondering if you could talk about this a bit.
Yeah, the growth of the administrative state is one of the 3 great evils, and I don't use that word lightly, that has emerged in the last 70 or 80 years. And it has happened at every level. We saw it especially in the last year under both the Trump and Biden administrations, frankly. This is neither a Republican nor a Democrat issue, a left nor a right issue. It's an issue. When Thomas Jefferson was president, there were just a few dozen employees of the federal government. There are now 2.1 million, growing by the day. And nothing against them. I'm not here to cast aspersions on people trying to make an honest living. The point is that our legislative branch lacks political courage. But newsflash, they have forever. Our founders knew that. And they built a system around that. And so we, the people, need to be exerting our influence on our elected representatives, regardless of their party, to stop deferring to the executive branch decisions that we expect in a constitutional republic our legislative branch to make. This happens at the state level, even in Texas. And again, not casting aspersions, I'm grateful for any man or woman in the public square. Even we overdid the shutdown. And we learned that lesson, hopefully never to happen again. But let's take a broader view, Josh, and understand that really what is at the heart of this is that Americans no longer feel connected to the outcome of what's happening in government. And whether it's the administrative state or something Rob Nadelson touched on really well, and that is the belief in federalism, I think the greatest genius, or one of the greatest geniuses of our founding, we have to have states standing up to federal overreach, whether that be unelected bureaucrats making decisions about there not being a crisis at the border, or that, as Biden's Department of Education issued in its first days in office, a critical race theory executive order mandating that if universities receive federal funds, they teach that nonsense. It is states. Texas, Connecticut, California, Florida, doesn't matter, but I guarantee you Texas is going to lead the way, who have to fight against that. Do you know why? Because it was the representatives of our states at the Constitutional Convention who had our sovereignty in their pocketbook, our sovereignty given to us from on high, representing us, who formed this government, and we did so, to sum up. Because God wired us not to be free to do whatever the heck we want, but to be free to do what we ought. And in order to do what we ought, in other words, in order to flourish in civil society with so many different people with different appearances, our states have to stand up to federal tyranny, whether it's Republican or Democrat, and the greatest of that tyranny is the administrative state.
Thank you. Now, I was wondering if you could actually briefly tell us, too, an interesting fact that I think is only now coming up because I think suddenly everybody's going back and reading their pocket constitutions, is that actually the reach of the federal government is limited by the Constitution, limited specifically within the boundaries of what is written in the Constitution. And now you now have some states and counties standing up for this. Could you briefly tell us just what that stipulation is? Then we'll go deeper into this.
That the power of the federal government is limited. Yes, it's just to sort of go back to my history teacher days. It's limited to external things, keeping the peace, levying taxes. We certainly wanted a federal government that was stronger than the Articles of Confederation. But if you look at the body of the Constitution, and then especially the tail end of the Bill of Rights, in Texas, we can recite often the 10th Amendment, that those rights are reserved to the states and, of course, the people thereof. It's really important that we remember we have many tools as people. Doesn't matter what state you live in, doesn't matter what mayor you have, what governor you have, whether through our individual action or through our states, for states and our local governments, as I'm sure Rex can talk about, to stand up against that. I will sum up by saying this, Josh. If you're out there, whether in the audience in person today, and God bless you for being here in person in New York City, or if you're out in the online audience, and you're feeling discouraged, that's what many people want you to feel. People who are addicted to power. Yeah. And the best way to fight against that is not to go cry in the corner, but to stand up here at the local level, the state level, the federal level, remembering the Constitution, remembering that the whole purpose of that was to put the federal government in a box so we could be free and do your part to take back this country.
And on that note, too, and on that note, too, we, of course, have Rex here leading the charge on the local level with that. I think 2 counties total, and then you have 1 state joined in, I believe, as well. And so tell us what's happening with this.
Yeah, and actually it was our neighboring county, Lander County, that became the first county in the nation to become a lifetime member of the Constitutional Sheriffs and Police Officers Association. So we're just following in their footsteps. But that's what got me started. It was shortly after they became a member of that CSPOA, they held a huge patriotic rally in Lander County. And I attended it, and I was just absolutely stirred by the patriotism that was shown there. So when I came home, I was determined to do the same thing in our county, and 2 weeks later we did. And I'd really like to stress to everybody how easy it is to do. When I returned home from that rally, I contacted the CSPOA. They sent me a resolution. I made it was drafted in 2014 by the CSPOA. I made a few changes to include the abuses that we witnessed during the pandemic, like closing the churches. I sent it to my fellow commissioners. I sent it to our district attorney, and I put it on our next agenda. And in 2 weeks, we became the second constitutional county. So it's very simple to do.
Yeah. And what a concept, right? People who are sworn to uphold the Constitution, our sheriffs and our local representatives, upholding the Constitution. And look how controversial it is.
Yeah, that makes national news and you get invited to New York. That's pretty amazing.
Now, Tim Barton, I wonder if you could give us kind of a broader view, because you, of course, have a large collection of not just documents, but of course, we went to his museum. You have swords, muskets, guns. I mean, everything. Just about everything under the sun. All kinds of interesting items that show a very different take on history. If you were to look at the way that America is being framed today, from the standpoint you have of all the information you've seen, what would you tell them? What does America represent from your standpoint?
Yeah, I think America is so unique in that it was a nation that, in a time in the world where people were fighting for freedom, when they were fighting for opportunity, when they were fighting for equality, America was on the forefront of that fight. And one of the things that, as we look at America now, there's a lot of ways that America is being labeled. In fact, we hear so often that the majority of our founding fathers were racists who were advocates of slavery. And it's so interesting that if you go back and read someone like John Jay, who was the original Chief Justice on the U.S. Supreme Court, during the Revolution, you can read some of his letters where John Jay says that it occurred to him the hypocrisy as they're fighting for their own freedom, that he was enslaving people. And so John Jay freed his slaves in New York and then became the leader of the anti-slavery movement of New York. And John Jay in his letter said that he's not the only one having this epiphany. This was an epiphany that many of his founder friends were having along the way. And it's something that as we look back, we tend to look at history very monolithically. And we see history and saying, you know what, in the midst of cancel culture, we say because they messed up, they should be canceled. And it's so foolish. One of the things, and this is me coming from a faith perspective, and so Pastor Che can probably address this even greater detail, but we believe as Christians that nobody's perfect, and that was the reason Jesus had to come. But that shapes the way I perceive history, because as I look back historically, my expectation is not that anybody should be perfect. My expectation is that everybody's messed up historically. And so when someone shows me, for example, that George Washington wasn't perfect, that never surprises me, because my expectation was that he would never be perfect. Instead, what I look back historically and see, and this is something that certainly as we go through so many artifacts, there were so many founding fathers that were open about faith and open about their view of God or even the influence of the Bible and what they did. What I see that is so unique in the American story is how often a perfect God used imperfect people and did really special things through them. We've lost those stories today, and that's why in the midst of when the 1619 Project first came out, and in 2019, all the craziness happens, you begin to see statues being torn down. And people initially said, we want to tear down statues of all the racists. And then it was like their lack of historic understanding was really exposed, because they began tearing down statues of like Frederick Douglass. And you're going, wait a second. Like, you have confused who these people were drastically. But even when
about 30 seconds.
Okay, even when George Washington's statue was torn down, it was something that he was accused of being a slave owner, and that's why he was evil. And it's like, wait a second, if you think the reason he had statues was because he owned slaves, you missed the whole point of Washington. The reason he was there was because of what he did in the Revolution, and he was the guy in charge of the Constitutional Convention. He's the guy that set the tone for the presidency. We have lost perspective of history, and that's the only reason that America is even capable of being villainized today, instead of recognizing how special and unique this nation is.
Now, speaking of the unique nature of this country, Pastor Shea, we have about a minute and a half left. But I was wondering, from your perspective, from a family that escaped the North Korean communist regime, and seeing stuff happen in this country that maybe reminds you of some of the oppression that took place there. I mean, could you share with us some of your perspectives?
Well, obviously, a totalitarian regime, probably the worst human rights record globally is in North Korea. 50,000 Christians are in concentration camps. And so communism, as you know, just the leaders of communism, if you think of Mao, Stalin, and Pol Pot, they have murdered 100 million of their own people. And so what's going on as far as slavery in China with the Uyghur concentration camps? Are you kidding me? Right. And they're making Nike shoes, and here we're celebrating, our relationship in the NBA with the Chinese government, and yet there's so much hypocrisy by supporting what's going on as far as the human rights. And so that socialism is subtly, through the media, through government overreach. It's not just a church. We're talking about 18,000 businesses in California declared bankruptcy. What about them? What about their family? What about the people that work for them? And it was so egregious that, you know, he locks down restaurant, he goes to the French Laundry, he locks down the schools where the moms can't go to work because they have to watch and monitor their kids on Zoom, and yet he's sending his kids to private school. It's such hypocrisy that's going on in our nation. And again, it's the government elite overreach. Government, as President Reagan said, is not the solution. They are the problem. And I am all for limited government. It is about we the people. And I believe in God we're going to see revival in this country, a spiritual revival, so that we can rise up. He's going to build his ecclesia, his church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. So I believe the best is yet ahead for us. I really do.
Amen.
Yeah, thank you. So, big thanks to our panelists. If folks, as everyone stays seated, we're going to go to questions now. For this, we're actually going to bring back up Alan Dershowitz and Robert Nadelson. We're going to get you some seats in a minute, so rearrange things a little bit. So, folks, you have questions, raise your hands, get them written down if you want to, and we'll have someone walking around with a microphone. And as soon as we're all situated, we'll get started with that. And also, if you have a question for anyone in particular, please address them in your question. All right, we can start having our person walk around.
Hi, my name is Juliette Fairley. I'm a freelance writer for various conservative publications across the country. My question has to do with the state of Texas. I was originally from there, was raised there. I live here in New York now. My question is, there's rumors that Texas is in a position to secede from the United States, and I wonder how likely that is.
I guess I'll take that question since you were looking at me, ma'am. Thanks. You know, our organization, the Texas Public Policy Foundation, which is the largest policy group outside D.C., has no position on that because we're fighting the battle that exists now. And I will answer your question pointedly, which you would expect from a fellow Texan, but with the caveat that it's coming from optimism. We're going to win the battle we're in now, and we're not going to need secession.
Yeah.
And very briefly, because I know you want to get to other questions, the reason we're going to win the battle now is because we caught the problems in time. Texas is imperfect. Go back to my good friend's point there, because it's filled with 29 imperfect people. But boy, it's as close to perfect as you can get. And without getting overtly political, because we don't do campaigns and elections, although we're conservative, the people who are in the Texas legislature who've abandoned their posts violate not only what it is to be a Texan, but what it is to be American based on our founding, which is that when you're elected, you dadgum better be in office, even when you know you're going to lose. And we're going to get election reform in Texas, by the way, very soon.
And Texas was smart enough to elect as a senator my former student, Ted Cruz.
Hi, John Rowe. I have a question for Rob Nadelson. You were advocating in the Epoch Times a piece of June 23rd for the Constitutional Convention, and you mentioned that here. For the following reasons, I think that the Constitutional Convention could be a disaster. The government currently is not following the Constitution, so how could changing it help? Correct reading of Article 5 shows that a convention would never be limited to any subject. It opens the entire Constitution to be amended. Article 5 and the necessary and proper clause of Article 1, Section 8 gives the U.S. Congress the power to decide how the delegates are selected, how many delegates there will be, and rules for running for the convention. Congress could alter the ratification process, which the founders did when they did the Constitution. Article 7 states, it stated that the ratification of the convention of 9 states shall be sufficient for establishment of this Constitution between the states. So even the Constitution, when it was written, they changed the way it was ratified. So could you please address that?
And just as background, too, this is Article 5. Basically, it's where you can create amendments to the Constitution from the ground up. You want to answer that question? Sorry. Sorry, at the end there. Sorry. Yeah.
Well, rather than take a whole lot of time answering the question, I'd like to refer people to the website that I moderate called the Article 5 Information Center, which has dealt with all of those issues at very great length. Let me just mention one or two of them. Number one, the Necessary and Proper Clause deals with laws. The courts have held that laws don't, properly speaking, don't apply in the constitutional amendment process. They don't. There are other problems with applying the Necessary and Proper Clause in this context. Number two, an Article 5 convention is not a constitutional convention. Right. Calling it a constitutional convention was an invention of the 20th century. Nobody ever confused it with a constitutional convention before that. The Article 5 convention is a limited, specific kind of convention. The courts tell us that Article 5 is governed by historical practice. There is an enormous amount of historical practice which permits conventions of states like this to be limited. I think I'll just leave it at that. Let me just say that this is a matter that I've gone into at great length over a period now of about 12 years. And I used to believe some of what you just said, but I have to say that I don't believe it anymore. One last point I should mention regarding the claim that the Constitutional Convention of 1789 changed the ratification process, and therefore an Article 5 convention could change the ratification process. That flies in the face, literally, of 200 years of case law. And again, the precedents are there available on the Article 5 Information Center website.
Josh, may I also point out that one of the things the Constitution says is that in order to have that ratified, it requires that 3/4 of the states do that. And so when people fear a runaway convention, I would point out you're not getting 38 states to agree on the sun coming up in the east and going down in the west, much less a specific amendment. And so the idea this could run away is probably not the most logical convention. What's actually, and I'm in favor of the Article 5 convention as stated in the Constitution, because there's two ways for amendment process, through Congress and through a convention of the states. But with that being said, I think what's probably the more realistic thing from an Article 5 convention is it actually shows different congressional members of the state that people of the state actually care about what's going on. And a lot of times we hear the adage, they don't see the light until they feel the heat of the fire. I think what happens is for a lot of them, they go, oh my gosh, people care about this issue, and all of a sudden they care about the issue. A Article 5 Convention of States amendment process is something that's very difficult to be done, but it can't be a runaway convention if it requires 38 states to do it. If 38 states agree to something, the Founding Fathers said we the people are the ones in charge. Well, if 38 states go that direction, that would seem to be the indication of we the people anyway.
Joshua, there's one more practical aspect to this too. Even if you believe that the 1787 convention ran away, which it didn't. People who believe that are misinterpreting the relevant documents. This is not 1787. The commissioners or delegates at a convention of states held to propose an amendment are appointed by and responsible to the state legislatures. We know that because the Supreme Court has essentially said so, as well as history.
I just want to make
this convention is going to be televised, right? And everyone is going to be able to watch what happens, including the people who sent the legislators who sent the delegates to the convention. The minute they get out of line, they get a phone call. You're coming home. It's a practical matter. It can't happen.
Mr. Dershowitz?
I just want to make a general point about the uses and misuses of history. History doesn't unfold in a left, right, conservative, liberal, Republican, Democratic manner. History is messy as could be. I just want to give you two examples from today. We heard a statement against the critical race theory, suggesting that Thomas Jefferson and the original Declaration of Independence, the first draft, were against slavery. I don't think you can read it that way. They were against the importation of slaves. They were against the slave trade, but Thomas Jefferson didn't free his slaves. Thomas Jefferson chased slaves on the same desk built for him by a slave, in which he said all men, and I really learned from you about that, men and the were created equal, but in the same desk he used to draft a poster giving $100, which was the equivalent of like $5,000, reward for somebody who escaped in order to have their freedom. And he punished them brutally when he caught them. History is messy. On the example of the religious views of the founders, let's understand one thing. There was no such thing as an atheist in 1776 and 17... There just weren't any. The closest you came to being that, and Jefferson was called an atheist when he ran, it was wrong, was to be a deist, a Unitarian. But let's understand that Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine were virulent anti-Christians. I don't even want to repeat here in polite company what they said about the New Testament. Words they used to describe the writers in the New Testament and the New Testament were so virulently anti-Christian. They were bigots in some ways. Both Adams and Jefferson, in their correspondence, hoped that you could keep Jesuits out of the country. They said, too bad for the First Amendment that it doesn't allow us to keep Jesuits out, because no country that has admitted Jesuits has ever had freedom and liberty. And then, in his dying day, in his great, great letter, just days before he died, on the 50th anniversary, he talked about the purpose of the Declaration to free the world, not only America, of monkish ignorance. And so we just shouldn't try to use history to support our ideology. Let history be. Let us understand that we are all complicated people here, and the people who framed our history were as complicated and as diverse in their views. So yeah, history matters. History counts. And history can teach us that certain views are absolutely wrong. And I think, Professor, you've pointed that out in a number of very brilliant articles. But I think history can't solve all of our problems for us because it unfolds in too complex a manner.
Is this on? Oh, there we go. My name is Daniel Kent Newmeyer. I do a show called the CT Strategist Report. My question to you is, are we over the falls? Has it gone too far? We have a local municipal property tax, which is completely unconstitutional. We have municipalities all over this country who are taxing us. We have no contract, we have no agreement with these people, and it's against the Constitution to tax private property in America. So we need to get behind this. And my friend Joe Petrina here, formerly of Wall Street Systems, has a constitutional case which he's put together. It's on hoodwink.net. You can look it up. We have a bunch of brochures here. And we're going to go get our money back, and we're going to make these people tax us correctly. We can have all the stuff we want, right? But you just can't make up taxes, come in, sell our houses to somebody, and then tell us that we have to sort it out in court on who owns the title to our house. So have we gone too far? Can we pull this back to the edge? You guys, I really appreciate this forum. Thank you so much.
I think Kevin Roberts, that'd be a good one for you, yeah.
Well, sir, thank you for your passion. Thank you for yours. No, I mean that. I mean that. I mean that. Heartfelt, because I hope my kids grow up to have the passion for this country that you do. God bless you. And we need more elected people in office to recognize that there's room for that passion. And there can be room for disagreement. I'll leave that to someone who's a greater expert on tax law. But let me say this, and maybe the preface was important, because I don't mean to be dismissive of your love of place. That frustration is why people are voting with their feet and moving to places like Florida and Tennessee and Texas. Come on down. The summer, it's been a mild summer. It's only in the 90s.
Anyone want to weigh in on the tax laws in the U.S.? It's okay. We can move on.
One more.
Richard Ammerling. I'm a physician. Virtually the entire response to the COVID crisis has been unconstitutional, tyrannical, and completely unjustified. Where is the legal pushback? Where has the Supreme Court been?
Go ahead.
Again, a very complicated issue. The Supreme Court has one case on this, Jacobson versus Massachusetts. It involved smallpox in the first decade of the 20th century. It involved a relatively small fine for people who refused to take the smallpox vaccine. We have some historical precedent. George Washington wrote a letter. Actually, he didn't write it. Hamilton wrote it, and George Washington signed it. Hamilton was a secretary. But he wrote a letter mandating that all of his troops get vaccinated against smallpox. I recently tried to buy that letter at auction, but couldn't get it because I really wanted it. The police power of the states is an issue that the Supreme Court has spoken to. The pandemic was a serious matter. I don't think any country in the world handled it perfectly. The one area where I do think constitutional rights were violated was that in a number of states, governors and mayors made legislative decisions. They made decisions about punishment, about closing churches, about other things that the Constitution doesn't allocate to governors or mayors. In fact, the Constitution only speaks in one way about that. It says every state shall be guaranteed a Republican form of government, Republican small r, obviously. There's no such thing as a city under the Constitution. There's no such thing as a municipality. The Constitution only recognizes states, cities, municipalities, counties. They existed at the time of the Constitution, but they're creatures of the state. The compromise that was made was that the state makes decisions about that. And so I think the constitutional issues involving the pandemic are going to come to the Supreme Court. I wrote articles about this going back to 1970 in which I outlined how the court and how the courts in general deal with emergencies, whether they be medical emergencies or other kinds of emergencies. And in general, they don't interfere at the time of the emergency. But then the cases come up after the emergency is over. And so I suspect we'll see, not in the next year, not in the next 2 years, but 3, 4, 5 years from now, a series of cases laying out the parameters of what can be done and what can't be done. None of us will be satisfied with the result. It will be, again, another compromise because the virus is real. You'll notice I was wearing a mask today. Many of you are not. The virus is real. The response to the virus, I had dinner the other night with the owner of Regeneron, the man who developed the cure that may have saved President Trump's life. The vaccine is real. Is it perfect? No. You know, the enemy of the good in every respect is the perfect. And there are no such things as perfect elections. There has never been a perfect election. There has never been a perfect vaccine. There has never been a perfect medical treatment. And the real question is, who gets to make decisions about imperfections? In a democracy, who gets to make the decisions when you have to weigh costs and benefits and when you have to make tragic choices? And I think we all agree that decision should be made by elected representatives of the government, subject to constraints of the Constitution. But we don't want the judges to be the primary, the initial decision makers. We want legislators to be the primary initial decision makers, subject to review. So we're going to see a lot of litigation, a lot more about that. And I commend you and others who have brought these cases immediately to the attention of the court.
So,
Thank you.
Shay, and then...
Yeah, I actually have a question for Alan and Rob, because, right now I'm very concerned about the Equality Act and the passage of that in the Senate, because to me it violates my conviction as a pastor, as a Christian, to have my tax dollars pay for abortion, or who I should hire as a pastor. That I would have to hire someone who's a transgender or something that would be...
You don't have anything to worry about. The courts will not require you to hire anybody who violates your religious norms. I predict here and now the Supreme Court is going to uphold the right of the baker not to make a cake for a gay couple. By the way, let me ask you as a religious person, this is a question I've always wanted to ask a pastor. So the New Testament doesn't deal very directly, and Christianity doesn't deal all that directly with being gay or being transgender, but it deals very directly with being divorced. There is no ambiguity about that. How come bakers don't refuse to bake cakes for divorced couples?
That's a great question, and to me, the Bible has to say a lot about divorce. I feel like in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, Paul says that if you're with someone who is not following the faith and leaves, then he's called you to peace, which to me, my understanding of that is remarriage. And so to me, I feel there's something about what I call the 3 A's: adultery, abuse, that's physical abuse, as well as emotional abuse, and abandonment.
Yeah, I agree.
And so as a pastor, I'm not for divorce, because divorce is just but to me, I don't see that, where the Bible is very clear in Leviticus about men dressing in women's clothes. It's very clear about homosexuality. Then Romans chapter 1, Paul gives them over to their sexual desires, men lusting after other men, women. But here's the good news. 1 Corinthians 6:9 says, "But such were some of you. But you've been washed, you've been sanctified, you've been changed." So we offer hope that you can be changed. I was a drug addict. As a pastor's kid, I was just gone crazy and rebelled against my parents. But they prayed for me, and I gave my life to the Lord. And one day, God delivered me from drug addiction, 3 years of addiction. And now here I'm a pastor, married 42 years, 4 kids, 3 of them are pastors. And I feel so blessed, and I'm so grateful for what God's done in my life. So I hope that answers your question. There are different views. There are different views.
Yeah, thank you. Robert Nadelson, you wanted to weigh in on the lockdowns?
Well, I think the moment for that may have passed. Nevertheless, I have the microphone. As Alan said, there's a case called Massachusetts versus Jacobson that upheld the principle of mandatory vaccination. However, the case was decided in 1905, and one of the conundrums that I've wondered about is why it has been cited so uncritically by so many courts. Because since 1905, an entirely different way of analyzing constitutional rights have arisen, the so-called tiers of scrutiny. In the case of vaccination, one has to demonstrate that fighting the disease is a compelling governmental purpose. I think we can stipulate that it is, but also that the requirement of vaccination and the other requirements are narrowly tailored or necessary to serve that purpose. And I saw many kinds of regulations and regulations being adopted that didn't seem to me to be narrowly tailored. For example, I'm from Colorado, which is a better state than Texas or Florida because we have mountains, right? And the Colorado governor, and by the way, I agree with Alan that some of these emergency decrees should have been issued by the legislature. But the fact is that the Colorado governor, like many other governors, had at his disposal broad delegations of state legislative authority. And almost everything he did, not everything, but almost everything he did was within the letter of the law. And one of the things he did was he banned interstate travel. You couldn't come in or leave Colorado. Well, since in 1905, the Supreme Court has declared that there is a right of interstate travel. And yet I didn't see any cases come down striking down that part of the order. Most of what did occur was in the religious context, where churches were treated in ways that were worse than the way pot shops and casinos and abortion clinics were treated. And the Supreme Court quite rightly said that that's not appropriate. So, but that still raises the question of why the courts didn't jump in to defend other constitutional rights, such as the right of travel. There's yet another wrinkle in this whole thing. The police power, to which Alan refers to, is a state police power. The federal government, as the Supreme Court has said many, many, many times, does not have a general police power outside of the federal enclaves and territories like Washington, D.C. So why do we have the President of the United States carrying the ball on a vaccine? Why do we have the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, imposing moratoria on evictions? I mean, these are classically state issues. Most recently, when someone challenged the power of the Center for Disease Control to impose moratorium on landlord-tenant evictions, Supreme Court refused to hear the case. And by the way, I'm not sure that the Supreme Court is going to uphold the rights of that Colorado baker not to bake a cake, because they just refused to take a case very similar called Arlene's Flowers, in which a woman refused to do floral design for a man who was getting married to another man, even though she had served him as his flower designer for many years. I'm not sure that there's a majority on the court to protect the Colorado baker, unless the majority decides to change the existing rules by which free exercise cases are judged.
Right, so,
but I'm far enough into the weeds, so let's stop there.
So we have time for one more question. Where's the one with the mic? It's over there somewhere. Okay.
Hi, everyone. Joe Rogas here. Thank you so much for a wonderful panel today. My question is really actually pragmatic. I'd like to take it to a level that we all can use. This is a wonderful discussion about the theories and sort of how we can be defending America. But while a lot of what we talked about today did seem to be a legal issue, but a lot of it kind of smatters of a cultural issue as well, right? We mentioned that there's a lack of history education, at the root of a lot of these beliefs. On the same breath, we may not want a nationally mandated curriculum in either direction either, right? So, and I have a bit of an educator's background, so there's three parts to this question. Number one, from a legal perspective, how can we bridge that gap between, a curriculum that we all want versus a curriculum that we have the freedom to choose? Number two, from an educator's perspective, how can we sort of embrace this complexity around history and avoid the alluring aspect of sound bites that just sound good? And then finally, I think education is everybody's responsibility, right? So what can folks like us be doing in order to support this fight of defending the Constitution?
So Robert Nadelson, I think you're the one best positioned on kind of all those fronts. If you'd like to, yeah.
Well, I think the best thing you can do, the single best thing you can do, is you can elect members of the state legislature who recognize their constitutional responsibilities. The Constitution not only reserves most powers to the states and to the people, but it also grants to the state legislatures certain specific functions. These are called federal functions. And one of them, for example, is the right to decide how presidential electors are chosen. And as far as I read the Supreme Court's pronouncement on that, they don't even need the signature of the governor to decide how presidential electors are chosen. So if you think that there are election integrity issues, then you need to elect members of the state legislature willing to deal with those issues. James Madison, in his lifetime, wrote a series of letters and also items of the Federalist in which he talked about the obligation and the power of states to interpose between the federal government and the people. In other words, when the federal government was abusing its power, then the states had the obligation to protect the people against that abuse of power. And he listed a number of methods. One would include non-cooperation, which the Supreme Court has held states can engage in. My own state of Colorado is engaged in a huge non-cooperation effort dealing with marijuana right now. The Article 5 amendment process is another example of interposition, and there are quite a number of others. The linchpin, I believe, of the entire federal system is, in fact, the state legislatures. That it's ultimately, the state legislatures really are better even than the counties, are best positioned to carry the battle for federalism. But that means we have to elect people to the state legislatures who understand what their obligations are.
And before we're over, Kevin Roberts, would you want to weigh in on that too?
Sure, and I know we're short on time, so I'll be brief. Thanks for your question. Thanks for being an educator. I'm a fifth-generation educator and have taught every level of students, from graduate students to pre-kindergarten. Have founded a school, have run a college, and now run a think tank. And I want to dovetail with what my friend Rob Nadelson has said, and that is to take it to what I like to call the sidewalk level. And that is that you got to do three things. The first is it starts with the primary source documents. That's the real beauty of history. What our friend Professor Dershowitz said about what history teaches us and what it doesn't, you learn that when you read the primary source documents. That's available at every level, and it should start, as many liberal arts schools do, in the elementary grades. And that's in any school. But the second thing you need to do, and this is for not just those of you who are parents and grandparents, but if you consider yourself, regardless of your political ideology, a member of the American civil society, you need to go to your next school board meeting. And it doesn't matter where your kids are in school. And let's remember, people of differing views can disagree agreeably. You've seen that tonight. Sure. Yeah. That we have to keep in mind. And at the school board meeting, you ask questions about the curriculum. And when you start getting hemming and hawing, either because the member just does not know, or they're hiding something, which I can guarantee you might be going on, you follow up with a private meeting. And then point 3, when you get frustrated by that experience, run for school board and win, as is happening all over Texas.
I just want to add one point to take it to colleges and universities. Colleges and universities are not owned by the current faculty. Colleges and universities consist of alumni, future students, the public, and today a relatively small group of people. Faculty, extreme leftists, radicals, anti-intellectuals, many of them, are dominating the colleges. And 15 or 20% of the student body are making all the noise. And the time has come for contributors to college, for contributors to state legislators in state universities, to make it clear that universities are a public trust. And they can't be used simply for partisan and political reasons. And it's hard, because we want academic freedom. But academic freedom includes the academic freedom of the dissenter, the academic freedom of the student who feels that he's being propagandized or she's being propagandized. And so I just want to generally support your view and elevate it beyond elementary school and high school into colleges and universities as well.
All right, folks. So we have time for one more question, apparently. Oh, no, sorry. I said it wrong.
Can I have a woman question? We need a woman question.
We have time for one more or no? Okay, okay, no more. I'm sorry. It was a misinterpretation. All right, folks, that's it. Let's give a big thanks to our panelists here. It's been wonderful. Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you. Well done.
you're going at the speaker.
I have to go upstairs. But I'll be at the reception.
Oh, hello. Jack, hello, nothing?
Does my mic work? Here, Roman.
Which one is working? All right, sorry guys, a couple of things. It should have been made clear that there is a closing remark. So one thing, unlike Joshua, I do have positive, I'm not going to do the bait and switch like Joshua. So after, now it works. So after the event, we do have, I know we've kept you all very hungry, right? So upstairs we have some food and snacks, and some of the speakers will actually be going up there. So I noticed there's quite a few hands that were still up at the end. You can go ask the speakers some questions. And now, also lastly, we have Stephen Gregory, the publisher, who can close out the event.
I found tonight's discussion very rich and very rewarding, and I want to thank all of our speakers for coming here tonight and sharing with us their insight and their wisdom. And I want to thank all of you for coming here tonight and making this possible and taking part. You've been a wonderful audience, and I look forward to the reception and getting a chance to say hello to you. As I mentioned earlier, we want to restore America by educating Americans. We believe that citizens who are truly informed about the Constitution and our nation's principles and history will support this nation in taking a healthy direction. That's what this night has been about. To get a grassroots effort to educate Americans started, we are issuing the Defending America Challenge. We are inviting individuals to share one piece of content from our website, which is epochtimesevents.com, epochtimesevents.com, with 5 others, with family, friends, colleagues, students, professors, anyone you know. On the website, one will find our special edition to the Constitution, on the Constitution, the documentary, America Rewritten, quizzes, and the video of this panel discussion tonight. And you'll be able to share any of them. There's one hitch, and that is we need to make a few changes to the website to support this. Once someone successfully takes part in the challenge, we want to recognize them for the effort. But to do that, we have to make a few changes in the website. So please keep an eye on the website, and but by all means, feel free to go ahead and start sharing our content. In succeeding months, we will have other events with other themes, providing more content suitable for sharing. We intend to keep this challenge going. In coming months, we expect to see content and programs on censorship, the integrity of the elections, and the threat of socialism. So please, spread the word, join in the challenge, encourage others to do so. Let's work together. Let's restore America. Thank you.
Check. Okay, great. So, if you'd like to partake in the food and the meet and greet, the stairwell is going to be right over there by the elevators where you came in. So next to the elevators to the left is the stairs. It's only one flight up. If you want to take the easy route, the elevator that can take you to the terrace is on that side. So see you all there in about 10 minutes. Facts always matter.
Hearing from everyone, from newsmakers to people just like you.
Deep dive interviews that challenge assumptions.
Bringing fast, compelling, first-hand news from China.